Hiya guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Retro Magazines. And this time I'd like to present this GM Magazine Issue 1 from 1988. Now while this doesn't have a lot of support for individual games, it does provide a wonderful glimpse into the games industry of that era. Now as usual I'll cover that on the desktop in a wee second. But before I do that, I'd like to take a moment to talk about my Patreons, who this week I have been advised make everybody around them feel 25% happier. And this I can only agree with, because they make me feel happier by their contributions and their support of this channel, which I can only show a tiny amount of the appreciation that I feel for it, because they are absolutely great. Now if you'd like to join them and help support the channel, or you'd like to see these videos a week early, or you'd like to become an honest-to-goodness fake Laird of Scotland, or you'd like to see one of the other offers we've got, then the Patreon's in the description down below. I'd love it if you'd check it out, it'd be very much appreciated. But anyway, let's have a look at GM Magazine Issue 1. So, this is GM Magazine, the Independent Fantasy Roleplaying Magazine. It's Volume 1, Number 1, and it came out in September 1988. Now this is slightly more damaged than most of the magazines. I tend to take care of things pretty well, but this one's a bit damaged because it's slightly over A4 sized. So when it's put into storage with other magazines, it tends to poke out slightly, only by maybe half a centimetre or so, but it's just slightly bigger, so the edges of the pages have all picked up some damage, slight tears and things. Now this is a generic role-playing magazine, dealing with the industry as a whole, much like Arcane did, but Arcane came out, what, 7 years later? But this doesn't really do the things I like in a role-playing magazine. Things like the early White Dwarfs that I've covered, Challenge Magazine, White Wolves, provide you with material for your games. Whereas this does that on a very slight basis. Only 5 pages of this are a scenario, a generic fantasy scenario. But everything else is about the industry. Now that makes this an absolutely brilliant look into the role-playing industry of 1988. And what was coming out, what games were available, what the trends were. But it means that this isn't a lot of use to you in your games today. This is just a historical document. Now, the cover's nice and colourful, but within most of its two-colour. So, we've got a sort of Dragonlance picture on the cover, because that's what's going to be on a lot of it. We open up, and we have a sideways advert here for Castle Mammon, which is a fist. Now this is Steve Jackson, the same guy who did the Fighting Fantasy games and founded Games Workshop. And this is basically, or was, a telephone choose-your-own-adventure, where you would phone up and at the end of the verbal description, it would say, you know, press 1 to make this decision, press 2 to make that decision. And it would take you through, obviously with you paying through your nose for the premium rate phone call. We've got an advert here for Mage Lords of Dorm, which the artwork isn't great, but it's got something to it. It's a bit punky. Then we're on to the table of contents, the introduction from Tim Metcalfe, Boughton and Wayne. Now, the magazine makes a lot of Wayne. He's this blonde figure here, with his rather terrible mullet. Warning, this magazine contains pictures of Wayne. I have no idea who he is. I'm not sure whether he's done anything else apart from this magazine, but they were definitely trying to make a thing that Wayne was the edgy one. Going past the table of contents, we've got a nice big double-page advert for the AD&D computer products, Heroes of the Lance and Pool of Radiance. Now, I think I played a bit of Heroes of the Lance and wasn't terribly impressed, but Pool of Radiance and all of its sequels, what was it, Secret of the Azure Bonds, Pool of Darkness, and there's another one, Curse of Azure Bonds? Can't remember. But that series of games were absolutely brilliant. I sank so many hours into them, and that's where these started. We've got some news. And the news is fabulous to me because there's just so much here which I've already covered on the channel. So we've got adverts here for Vizier Rocks, for Living Steel. We've got the novels for the Cyborg Commando game, the Gary Gygax science fiction game. We've got Awful Green Things from Outer Space. Talking about Grenadier miniatures. different purchases of companies, games days for Games Workshop, stuff about Dragonlance, short pieces of news, Chris Archelios, fantasy art book, stuff for Mech Warriors, Forgotten Realms novels, Dark Walker on Moonshade and the Crystal Shard. Absolutely fabulous books all. We've got a GM competition. Win a Labyrinthe adventure. So a live role-playing. The Micronet Shades multi-user game. Give a dragon a good home. Different adverts here. Amiga User International, so computer magazines advertising in here. A Reading the Runes glossary of different role-playing terms, conventions, dice, non-player characters. So they're trying to get people into it. We've got a double-page review here of Heroes of the Lance and Pools of Radiance. They seem to rate them quite highly. Heroes of the Lance gets 10 out of 10 for graphics, which people might have difficulty believing now, but yeah, that was quite pretty at the time. Even though they seem to have mixed them up, because that's Pools of Radiance, that's Heroes of the Lance, because it was a sideways scrolling one. We've got an interview with people behind the games. You know, how long did it take them? How long did it take you to create the computerized version of AD&D? 1 year. It'd be nice if you detail a bit more than just very short answers, but that's his want. For some reason, a lot of the adverts here sent in seems to be very faded. What kind of role player are you? Well, I have to say I went through this and I'm none of those kinds of role player. Question 1. In the course of an RPG and facing an upcoming melee, the GM suddenly announces that one of your party has become pacifist. Do you kill the pacifist? Use the pacifist as a sacrificial decoy. Ignore him for the rest of the game. Try to reason with him. Do nothing because your whole party are pacifists anyway. Well, if somebody decides to become a pacifist, then they've decided to become a pacifist, and I would let them. So, is that ignoring him, or trying to reason with him, do nothing? I don't understand. All of these. They announce that your character has become passive. What do? Protest in a loud voice and ignore the GM's ruling. Produce 2 ring binders full of background information which proves your character would never become a pacifist. Accept sullenly and take little further part in the game. Accept and try to convince everyone else in the party to give up their evil ways. Doesn't matter because your characters are always non-violent. And it rates you depending on which choice you've made, whether you're a great role player or over the top, or you just don't do enough. Another very faded advert for hobby games. Paint shop, so how to paint miniatures. A big advert with Joe Dever, the guy behind Lone Wolf, showing off his gorgeous miniatures, because he obviously was a very strong role player, and announcing the start of the Highway Holocaust, Freeway Warriors, choose your own adventure, Mad Max style. Advert for Commodore Computing International. A review of Fist, how to cut the cost, subscription form for GM. Space 1889, Sky Galleons of Mars, the space combat game with steam-powered ships. All you ever wanted to know about role-playing. So, introductory, along with a picture of Wayne. A wealth of fantasy awaits you on the GM. So many games here. Twilight 2000, Living Steel. Choose Your Own Adventure books. We've got Sorcery, which I've covered before. Dragon Warriors. I think I've got one of those books. I can't remember if I've covered it on the channel, because I don't have the whole game. I've only got this second book, which was Magic. Various computer games, from City of Thieves, which was a very traditional text adventure. Well, I suppose it did have graphics. Star Command, Pool of Radiance itself. Then we're on to live role-playing. Got a review of Greek Africa here. A review of Living Steel, which they rate fairly highly, but 7 out of 10 for playability and value for money. Well, I can understand why they don't give it a high rating for playability, because the rules were a bit difficult. As I've said before, Living Steel written by NASA scientists when they were taking a break from NASA. Literally written by rocket scientists. But I love the background for Living Steel. I think it's one of the best role-playing game setups. Up there along with Twilight 2000. In just setting the players somewhere and releasing them. letting them shape everything. We've got game reviews here, Shadowgate, Micromud, Mindfighter, an absolutely fabulous adventure. I can't remember if it's Commodore 64 or Commodore Amiga I played it on, probably the Commodore 64. Came with a wonderful book where a psychic boy is mentally projecting into their body in the future after a nuclear war, and he has to communicate things back to the rest of his friends to stop the nuclear war. And that's what the adventure is. You're investigating this post-Holocaust world, but sending messages back to the other players to get them to do things, or other characters, rather. Got a review for Cyborg Commando, which gets a pretty high rating, given that I consider it to be one of the worst role-playing games ever written. It's laughably bad, but they quite rate it. Overall, Cyborg Commando is a very good product. This said, it's not a game for the novice. It's not a game for anyone. It's silly. Gary Gygax presents Fantasy Master role-playing aids. Various role-playing zines here. Review of Saturnalia. Battletech. That's the version of Battletech I got into. This is very much my era of everything. Raiders of Cardalan. Assassins of Dol Amroth for Middle-earth role-playing. Cry Havoc. Got a section on Gamemastermastery. Very useful. We've got the letters page called the Axeman Cometh. And we've got an interview with Terry Pratchett. Now, this is an interview about how he was a role player, how he played some Dungeons and Dragons. And that kind of connects to my life a bit, because I should have released a video. I'm recording this first, but a video should have come out on my channel earlier about how Terry Pratchett was a member of my role-playing group. It's kind of not the best story in the world, but I have a connection with Terry Pratchett, and he was a member of my role-playing group. Round about this time, it was roughly just about when Sorcery was released, so 1988, before he was a massive name. Anyway, carrying on, we've got live role-playing, expanding rapidly, section on that. Pearls of Wisdom, a fantasy story, very nicely illustrated. A massive info dump on Dragonlance, including talking about all the different novels out. And then in the very back, for the last 5 pages, we've got The Stench of Death, a systemless scenario suitable for most fantasy role-playing games systems, and the very first scenario written especially for evil characters by John Sutherland, Nigel Cross, and Simon Farrell. And it's quite well done. It lays out various events, various scenes, and then you've got notes on how they might go out and be different. So it's well thought out. But I don't find it particularly gripping. And the fact it's just 5 pages at the very back, generic fantasy. We've got an advert here for next month, which will be mainly about Battletech, Spirit of Adventure, live role-playing, Secrets of the Dungeon Master, the GM watches the Watchmen, obviously not the movie. On the back cover, we've got Blood and Steel for Renegade Legion Centurion. Absolutely gorgeous looking advert. Now, GM Magazine was a way of keeping up to date with the news in role-playing. But as I said, the only really useful bit is the 5-page adventure in the back. And it's so specifically fantasy, and so specifically for evil characters, that I don't think a lot of people are going to get use out of it. But anyway, it was a great magazine at the time. It's well before the internet turned up, so all of this news you weren't really going to find out through any other source unless you were getting zines, newsletters, or magazines like this one. But anyway, I think I've whittled on for quite long enough as usual, so thank you very much for watching. But as always, most of all, you look after yourselves, and I'll catch you later. Bye now.